right, we're back. This album, I think, I haven't fact-checked this, but this might be the earliest 1960s album that we're going to talk about. It was released on February of 1960. It's currently number 63 on besteveralbums.com. Now, it was actually recorded May 4th and 5th of 1959, and then the track Naima was recorded on December 2nd of that year. The initial recording of this album was 2 weeks after John Coltrane's final recording session with Miles Davis on Kind of Blue. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is kind of the compare and contrast of Giant Steps versus Kind of Blue, because they're very different albums, and John Coltrane played on both. This was John Coltrane's first album under Atlantic with his new contract, and his 5th studio album overall. This album exemplifies the sheets of sound concept that we talked about before, which, as a reminder, is the improvisational style of jazz that Coltrane brought to jazz and really transformed jazz, or at least took it in a new direction. And I know John joked about there being more heroin on this album, but as a reminder, Coltrane had already quit drugs by this point, so this is a heroin-free album and free zone this week.
Did he go back to the heroin?
No, he never did.
He never did. Okay.
Yep.
Good.
He did not make it out of the 60s, did he? If I remember correctly.
No, he died young.
Yeah.
So there, and we're not going to talk history really of John Coltrane, because we did that back in episode 9. Please listen to that to get the full scope of him up to this point. This recording crew is really two different groups of artists. We have John Coltrane on all the groups, obviously, but Tommy Flanagan was on piano, and Paul Chambers was on bass, and Art Taylor was on drums for some of the tracks, and then it was Coltrane, Paul Chambers, Wynton Kelly played the piano on Naima, and Jimmy Cobb played drums on Naima. Both of those guys were members of the Miles Davis Kind of Blue Quartet, so that was a reunion of sorts when they re-recorded that. You also have appearances by Cedar Walton and Lex Humphreys, who played piano and drums on alternate versions of Giant Steps and Naima, which you can listen to if you're interested. The title track, Giant Steps, is really important in jazz history. It's become a piece of jazz that people in jazz education programs study, and is often considered a rite of passage for aspiring horn players to be able to improvise over the chord progressions in Giant Steps. Giant Steps and Countdown, another track on this album, both are extremely fast, and their tempos are at 290 and 340 beats per minute, switching keys roughly every 2 beats. And then a couple of other interesting factoids on this album. The Cousin Mary song is dedicated to his cousin Mary Alexander. Saida's flute song is named after his stepdaughter. And the song Naima is named after his first wife, Juanita Naima Grubbs. The final track is called Mr. PC, and that's named after the bass player Paul Chambers.
Wasn't politically correct?
It was not politically correct. It was Paul.
Was that even a term back then?
Probably not.
Probably not.
So back to what I was saying about the contrast between Kind of Blue and Giant Steps. Kind of Blue is very minimalist if you listen to it, and a lot slower and more moody, I would say, than Giant Steps is. Giant Steps is packed with notes. It's energetic. There's different, I would say, different styles of jazz or sounds of jazz on here. And there's also there's just a lot going on. This is his album. All the tracks on this album are originals, versus when we talked about My Favorite Things, those were all covers. So you really get the full scope of John Coltrane's talent here. I did read or tried to read a little bit about kind of the technical aspects of Giant Steps and an album and why it's important. But when you start, or at least for me, when I'm reading about music terminology, it's like reading a foreign language. I have no like understanding or even basic understanding of anything of that they're talking about. So for all of you that are interested, you can go out and search that out.
But Josh, you said earlier that they're every 2 beats they're changing keys.
Yeah, that's what I read.
That's crazy.
Well, and you can hear it too, because I mean, you can't miss Coltrane's style of saxophone in this. It's up down, it's fast. He's running scales. It just does seem like it almost was designed to be learned by aspiring jazz musicians and musicians for that matter in another era, which obviously it wasn't. But I don't know too many people who study music who don't love this album.
Right. Another interesting thing, there's 26 chord changes in the 16-bar theme of Giant Steps. And the famous Coltrane changes are also featured on this album. Those are chord progression variations that he, I guess, popularized, or at least, I don't know if he invented. I think he invented them, basically, which is why they're named Coltrane changes.
Don't they call them angular sometimes, if I remember correctly, and the idea is that they go up on an angle and then down on an angle, right? So
yeah, there's something too about the pentatonic scale or something that I read, and I was like, okay, this is all. I'm out of my element, as they say in a Big Lebowski. But what did you guys think of this? I know we always talk about the challenge of talking about jazz, but what did you think of this album?
I've been doing a lot of my homework on jazz and trying to listen to a lot more of it to put it in reference. But I would say this is the first, even more so than my favorite things, this was the first jazz album that we've done that sounded very familiar. I could recognize all the parts in the jazz early, whether it be the piano or Coltrane's saxophone. It was very clear. Remember how we kind of talked about not being able to, for example, pull out what Dolphy's sound sounded like, or Sanders, right? We only knew it from reading about it. I think now I'm at the point where if I were to hear a track and hear a John Coltrane saxophone part, I'd either know it was him or someone playing him, because it is that's that angular I talked about before, the up and down, just the frantic fastness of it, and then the compositions themselves with, like the free jazz, there's the space and then the frantic playing, but there's just something very disciplined about his style that got loosened later with, say, a Pharoah Sanders or Dolphy, like we talked about, and even later Miles Davis. And you can see, like you mentioned with Miles Davis, the sparseness of you would never say this album is sparse. Because when Coltrane comes in or the piano comes in, it hits, and it hits well, and the drumming is done, not to use an overused word, but it's a very tasteful drumming. It supplements what's going on, and you have to kind of listen for it, but when you hear it, it's impossible to not hear it anymore. But you have to know to listen for it, because that's the purpose of it, right? And that's how I'd describe it. It almost sort of puts the color by numbers on the broad strokes that are the piano and the saxophone. So I really enjoyed this album a whole lot. And to think that this was made in 1960, you could almost feel modern jazz, which is, I think, the jazz we identify as the jazz we know best, being created, which was kind of cool to listen to.
Yeah, I would say what's stood out to me immediately, as you know, with this album compared to my favorite things, is the pace. Is just how it's much faster, right? And certainly, if you know kind of blue, it's much different than that. It's more upbeat, right? It's kind of it hits you a little bit more and gets your attention right off the bat. And most of the album is like that. I think there might be a track or two towards the end that's a little bit on the slower side, but for the most part, it kind of once it hits you with that speed and that energy, it doesn't really let go too much of it. I agree, John. I try to do a little bit of this with this album that you had mentioned. I think maybe maybe it was Eric Dolphy, or it was another jazz record that you talked about specifically listening. I'm listening to this album right now, and I'm just listening to this instrument or this part.
Yep.
I can't say that I did that exclusively with this album, but there were parts where I'm like, let me just do that for this little part of this track or for this entire track. And I did notice the drums, right? Because the drums are they're in the background. We talked about Keith Moon and how hard he beat the drums, right? This guy's they're not doing that here, obviously.
Right, and they're out front in the Who too by the design
Right.
and the production. Yeah,
exactly.
Not here.
And this is like the opposite of that. But when you pay attention to them, the intricacies and the stuff that they're doing, and the guy, it's very interesting, right, to listen to a jazz drummer drum like this.
Yeah.
It's definitely unique to that genre, and it's impressive. It doesn't sound like it's an easy thing to do. So I did like listening to that. I will say it's still I still don't feel like I am knowledgeable enough in jazz in general to really differentiate. I'm still having that issue with trying to be able to pick out one thing versus another. I think Coltrane's making a little bit more sense to me in terms of his sound.
Right.
But there's plenty of other saxophone players that I don't know. Like I haven't really listened to a whole lot of Charlie Parker, right? So he's kind of one of the other main quintessential saxophone players. I know we did Eric Dolphy, but that's just totally different, right? That's not so much because saxo, it's everything with Dolphy. That was just almost a different genre of music altogether.
So to get a little music geeky, I think one thing that, because I delved into like what is it that I can recognize Coltrane's playing of the sax compared to say Pharoah Sanders, right, which who also plays it, and I was able to identify that what I was hearing is that he plays those fast chord progressions, and in between it he separates them with what are called major thirds, and that's the note that you hear in between him running the scales. So, and that's why I've learned when I'm listening to jazz, what I do is when I listen to it, I identify the instrument I want to hear, and I listen to it throughout that album. And then the next time I listen to it, I listen for a different instrument. And then what I find is that once I've listened to those instruments, then I'm able to piece together the whole listen. And it's hard because a lot of times there's like 6 or 7 different instruments, right? So you're really saying you got to listen to this 6 or 7 different times, right? And I'm not always going to do that. But I find that really helps because when you know what everything's doing, especially thinking that all of this is always improv, right? Can you imagine having to be his pianist or the drummer or anybody in his band with him improvising these ridiculous, 26, note pieces? It must have been insane to be in the band.
Yeah, I mean, that's a testament to how talented all those guys are, because the fact that they can just keep up with that or, adjust on the fly is incredible.
Go ahead, Josh.
I was going to say, I always wonder, this got me thinking, like, when these songs are written down, is there like a bass, version of the song, and then the improvisational stuff is not written down, and it's just all that just changes every time they play the song, or is there a bass improvisation that's also written down when he wrote these songs? I don't have an answer for that. I'm asking you guys or the
I
listener.
was just about to ask the same thing, because when you talk about these are originals as opposed to my favorite things, which were all arrangements of, or covers, if you can even call them covers. Probably more different arrangements is more like it. But yeah, it's like at what point is what is he writing down, right? What is the structure? And some parts you can kind of do because he kind of revisits certain patterns, so that certainly is part of it. But is that it? Is it just like a couple of parts and then it's like, all right, guys, so then you're going to do a solo here, we're going to go this here, look for me for the change here, and boom, boom, boom. Like, it doesn't seem like a whole lot of this is actually written down. But John, I don't know if you have more insight into that.
I don't, like I said, a lot of what I do is I'll hear things and then I'll kind of dig back because I don't have the music background in terms of the technical nature, but I'm starting to put 2 and 2 together. Like, for example, the 2-5-1 progression is one of the most common progressions in all of music, but especially jazz, and that is something that Coltrane uses for. I've noticed in both of his albums so far. I'll be interested to see when we do a Love Supreme if it still stays. I'm sure it will because you would recognize it right away. And I'm gonna post something on @combingthe on Twitter that shows that 2-5-1 progression.
But what does that mean? What does 2-5-1 mean?
It's the notes themselves, and it's the sliding. It was described to me by someone who would know as, think of it this way. Cadence, and I don't want this to be too deep, but here's the best way to describe it. Weaker cadences are like commas, and stronger cadences are like periods. So you start, and then you put the weaker cadences in, and you build to a stronger cadence, and it stops. And then you start again with a piece, and then you do the weaker cadence, and then it builds up. So like, and that's how Coltrane plays those long string of notes. If you notice, there's little ups and downs inside of it, but he's still playing ridiculously fast. And so it sounds like he's constantly going up the scale because it's so fast, but when you listen to it more carefully, he's just playing 2-5-1 progressions, and what it sounds like going up is just the 5 note played faster. It's like I said, it's very dense.
Yeah, I think I got about 15% of that. Yep. But that's not because of you. I'm starting just to see that there's, I think, and I have some very, musical knowledge. I did, I took a theory class, and I did, play in a band and stuff like that. So some terminology makes sense, but it's also, it seems like we're getting, with jazz in particular, it seems like it's getting a lot more academic, a lot more textbook, a lot more, and I guess you could say that with probably more rock and pop music, because it's all that, music's all coming from the same places. But it just seems with jazz, because first of all, it's pretty much all instrumental, right? I mean, you have some singers and stuff like that, but the majority of like the jazz that we're talking about here is instrumental, and a lot of it's improvised, and it just seems like there's more. It's more complex. And again, maybe that's it. Maybe my attention span is such that I'm just that this is going to be a genre for me that I'm fine with, that I like, as long as it's not, I don't think I like the avant-garde stuff. I can't ever see myself like actively, why would I want to listen to this? It's almost like, the same thing with like horror movies. Like, why do I want to go be terrified for 2.5 hours? I'm going to go, that's not a fun experience for me.
But I find that I appreciate those more as I listen to Coltrane. I'm glad we started with that stuff, because I think if I had gotten to it later, I might not have appreciated the way we listened to it. Was interesting because we got the complex stuff, and now it's sort of like looking at the ingredients list, right?
Right.
Yeah, and for those listeners that are curious about this album, I find it an enjoyable listen, or at least it's not challenging in the way that some of the other jazz albums that we've listened to are. I find it, you could put it on in the background, and what am I trying to say? It's not like industrial music or something like that. It's you can recognize patterns, and there's some really good solos in this album too, and you can pick those things out, like John was saying.
Well, and the reason it's so familiar, I think, to you guys is because this has basically been the standard for people playing modern jazz improvisation. They basically, once you start to become a jazz musician, it's like, okay, can you play giant steps? Mm-hmm. And so because of that, it's so highly influential that for jazz, it's in some ways, it's kind of like when you listen to like Satisfaction by the Stones or My Generation by the Who or some of the Beatles stuff, and basically everything builds off of these things to later, that R&B bass. That's kind of what Giant Steps is for jazz, from my understanding. And kind of it's like you cross the threshold into becoming a good player in jazz if you can take the basic progressions from Giant Steps and do your own improvisations, or play Coltrane's improvisations at a solid level.
Well, I think too, because jazz is not, you can't really say it's a popular genre, right? That it's something that's top of the charts, and it's really well known and really and consumed. But when it is, when it does seep into pop culture, when you are exposed to it a lot of times through like movies or TV, it's stuff like this, these Coltrane albums that we're listening to, that's where that familiarity comes from. It's like, oh, okay, this is a sound that you might see in a movie that's kind of set like this, or even you might even be in a restaurant or a bar yourself or something, and you're hearing something like this, and I think for me, and maybe for a lot of other people too, that it ends up being, it's nice, it's background music, right? It's a comfort, it's like a calming thing, or it's something that kind of pep you up a little bit, but I think that if you do decide to do something more like what you're doing, John, is like being that focused, a laser focus on what's going on with this instrument. Let me listen to this entire record, just focusing here, and then maybe seeing how they all play together, and then you're going to 5-1-2 or whatever, whatever the time, whatever those are. There's so much more involved in it. I can see people getting really into it, but it does seem like it's a laborious activity.
But see, I would say here's what you could do as a task if you want to kind of do an academic exercise that doesn't feel like an academic exercise. Remember we talked about arpeggios before, and I gave the example of like Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven and the Star-Spangled Banner, like that, dun, 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 dun. Like Coltrane is doing that in his sax all over this. That's part of that sheets of sound, right? But I think you have to listen to people not as talented as Coltrane play arpeggios to appreciate how freaking good John Coltrane and his pianist are at playing arpeggios. So once you hear people playing arpeggios satisfactory level or even very good, and then you hear him, you go, oh shit, okay, that's the virtuoso playing that we talk about. And that's really what allowed me to appreciate Eric Dolphy, because I was like, wow, okay, now I'm starting to see how he plays his instrument and what he can do compared to the average person. And you joked a little bit about, Kenny G playing the sax, and he's a very good sax player. But the difference between that background music style he plays and like the virtuoso style of these guys in the 60s free jazz, I think there is a very clear, the more you listen to jazz, the more you can get it.
Well, I'm sure that comes out, yeah.
I'd love to dig back into like Thelonious Monk and Miles Davis, and I might even do that on my own time just to kind of keep working backwards to see where it came from. But I'm now, I think, able to identify John Coltrane as a virtuoso from doing some homework. And it's not for everybody, you know what I mean? I'm not saying you have to do it, but it can come if you listen to it enough.
Well, I played arpeggios in band, and I was really shitty at them. So I could definitely say that he is better at playing those than I am. I don't even remember what they were exactly, or like what defined an arpeggio versus a scale.
Broken chords, man. Broken chords.
So,
yep.
But
laid up.
yeah, but it's no, I like it, and I think would you say, John, that that's something that you do sometimes with just rock music or other popular music? Is
no.
Like, let me focus on the guitar, let me focus on the bass.
I should amend that. I was going to say no, but sometimes I do. It depends on the band. I don't do it consciously though. I think it'll just like Sly and the Family Stone. The first listen, I listened to all of it, but I mean, how could you? I definitely could have listened to that album for just the bass lines and just listened to them because they were fascinating. And I do find that bass and drums in traditional rock music are where, when I get into an album and just listen to it, that's where I go. But I will say that with jazz, I kind of knew going in that I was going to have to take an academic view on it. And so I've started, and I knew we were going to get a lot of jazz in a small period of time. So I really have tried to commit to doing the listen that way.
We're not doing any jazz after the 60s, are we?
I don't think
No,
so.
Kind of dies still.
I think there's a Miles Davis album in the 70s.
Oh, there is. There's Bitches Brew in like 1970. Brew, yep. But we're not getting like any Wynton Marsalis or anything like that, like that's
no,
at
and
some
that,
point.
And that's the thing. Jazz kind of fell off the cultural touchstone as popular music, right? When the 70s came, which is kind of fascinating in its own right.
Is that going to be rock in like 20 years? Is rock going to totally actually?
Well, it is. It is. It's what it is now. That's what I was going to go to. I was going to kind of say it's kind of like what's happened to rock in the last 10 years. It's now become an archive type of music that exists, but exists for people that remember the classics and still play it, but in a much more underground version.
Yeah, jazz became more academic in some respects too, or that's what happened. People that were really into it took it to an extreme level, and then it became less popular. So, and
that is not what happened to rock. I would argue, rock. I just think rock got fused right into different things and became Yeah, that's a whole different conversation.
Probably
for another time.
like rock, jazz is still. I mean, they're both still out there. It's not like people stop playing. It's like there's plenty of musicians that are doing this and really into it, and there's fans that are really into it. But it's not hitting any of the major charts or pop culture or anything like that. It's just kind of it's there. It's there if you want to seek it out, but it's not in your face.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that sounds like a good point to end it on for this episode.
I think so.
I'd recommend more Coltrane, right? We got one. Was it one more Coltrane coming up?
Yeah, Love Supreme. We're going to cover that as well.
Right on.
So you get the whole breadth of a good representation of Coltrane at least.
Yeah, we'll be able to have comparison pieces, which I think will be nice because I haven't given it a full listen yet, but I've definitely heard Love Supreme is different in some ways.
Before we go, let's compare these two. Do you guys have a preference of one over the other? I mean, John, you kind of alluded to that maybe a little bit.
I enjoyed this one more than I enjoyed my favorite things, and I think that's because it's original compositions, and I felt, not to make a poor reference right here, but this is like the pure version of John Coltrane. I know heroin references with Coltrane are dicey, but like if the other one was just him doing virtuoso playing on other people's stuff, this is what it sounds like when he's improving, and so I did prefer this style.
Yeah, I preferred this as well. It's a nice comparison piece to My Favorite Things, though. You can see where his improvisation comes into play on a song you recognize. That's a good entry point.
Yeah, and I'd say I'd slightly prefer this. I do like it a little bit more upbeat, but it's not very much. Like I really enjoyed the other one as well, and just in general, and maybe it'd be different if I was much more focused in listening, but there wasn't too much of a difference for me in terms of just my overall enjoyment. Now, that's clearly different. He's doing different things, and there's different structures and whatnot. But my overall enjoyment, I can't really differentiate too much between the two. Maybe this one just a little bit better because of the more of the upbeat nature of it. But yeah.
Yeah.